Ukrainian soldiers entering a Russian trench. Their armored vehicles would take them into a battle with a dry land dug by human work and with the earth turned over by explosions. It was a place that smelled of gunpowder, fear, and violence. There they would find the fragment of hell dumped on earth. The soldiers would make choices about their own lives and those of others in matters of seconds, while the sounds of dispersing ammunition were confused with the united mortars and the last prayers, both from Russians and Ukrainians. This is not a story about heroes. It's a story about the orders that govern a soldier's life and the chaos he plunges into in the arms of death. On September 5th, 2022, Ukrainian soldiers were given the mission to invade Russian positions. The fulfillment of these orders would lead to acts of courage and desperation on both sides, whatever the beliefs or political positions of these men. This story is about that. About the soldier, his orders, his life, the responsibility of his leaders. It's about how chaos, war, and death toast with chalices full of the blood of combatants while laughing at the plans of men with stars on their chests who think they master the art of the battlefield. The squad was made up of 22 soldiers. The leaders of the 56th Motorized Infantry had given them a mission. They took the Russian trench near Pisk in eastern Ukraine. The village had been under Ukrainian control since 2014 when the Dnipro battalion took it and remained in place, ignoring orders to withdraw. The conflicts escalated to the point where the place was bombed with thermobaric ammunition until almost nothing remained of the quiet village. The TOS-1S thundered nightmares into the soldiers and civilians. Only the poorest, unable to move, remained mentally or physically injured. The Russians took the village in a brutal offensive in August of 2022. Since then, they have used it as a point for attacks in the direction of Pervomsk. The Ukrainians have not given up on the place. The sergeant, Angelash Volodymyr Petrovich, was given orders that day for a new attempt to take the trench. The attack the day before had not been successful, but the commander assured the sergeant that he was sure that day would be successful. Experienced from other battles, Angelush furrowed his brow looking at his companions. The plan was simple: advance with the BMPs and divide the squad into two, making a pincer movement that would lock the enemies. Ivo Mikolaevich, the Vraja machine, would be the commander of Bravo squad, while Angelush would advance with Alpha squad. The soldiers were not at the meeting, but it's said that there were harsh words exchanged between Angelush and the high command. During the briefing, soldier Serich Chutkov noticed how swift the orders were and the visible discomfort on the sergeant's face. Even so, they loaded up with ammunition and climbed into the BMPs ready for the day's combat. Chutkov saw another BMP advancing down the dirt road. The target was further ahead, silent for now, with no indication that amidst those holes, death was crawling, looking to embrace anybody that fell and bled on the ground. The BMP pilot demonstrated his combat experience. He jumped over mounds of earth, the tracks moving swiftly. Despite not being assigned to the battalion, he acted in sync to place them less than 20 meters from the trench. The men jumped quickly, taking position behind the hills, already hearing the whiz of the Russian ammunition. Sutskov barely felt the impact of the jump. Such focus when the boots dragged pebbles and his legs moved him to the first hills of the trench. Aka stood up for the suppression fire, not bothering to aim. It was still relatively warm in September, and he was already sweating as much from the effort as from the tension of the moment. The first grenades flew to make the enemy duck, to make room for the colleagues who had been left far behind when they jumped from the vehicle. The smoke from the explosions rose meters above, along with the screams of the Russians on the other side. The Ukrainians reached Siltskov shortly after to join in the taking of one of the shelters. It was a tense moment as they took turns looking for a simple entrance. Any mistake could be fatal. They shouted among themselves, warning that there was a bend before the Russians' hideout, which protected them from grenades and would only make the attackers expose themselves much more. The soldier Alexei appeared, warning that he would try to throw a grenade. He was bold to expose his body while looking for the right angle, but came back safe while the smoke took over the enemy shelter. The Ukrainians took advantage of that moment for an initial attack with a PKN. The machine gun made the Russians duck, giving time for Shukov to advance and empty the entire AK-47 magazine into the enemy shelter. He saw the Russian inside and heard the moan almost drowned out by the insane sound of the ammunition leaving the rifle barrel. The movement had to continue. The tension under the sun was clear in the men's voices. Angelus's commands came in shouts as they tried to decide what to do with the next Russian shelter. Shutskov pulled out the grenade launcher, ran to a new position, hearing the Russians' shots whizzing over his ears. He got a brief view of the entrance to that shelter and fired a precise shot that spread flames, smoke, and screams of pain from inside the hideout. But it wasn't enough to eliminate the Russian defense. Sergeant Angelus himself crawled over the hot ground to target one of the opponents. It seemed like there would finally be a chance. They would be able to eliminate the defenders inside the shelter to enter the trenches. They were close to getting out of that precarious position. But it happened that new dice were rolled by the warlord and chaos was redistributed on the battlefield. The amount of shots increased. A beehive seemed to have been stirred up, and now the stingers were spreading among the Ukrainians. The shots landed near Alexei, kicking up sand and ripping a scream from him. I'm 300, he screamed with his hand filling with blood as he held his neck. Sutskov saw where the shots were coming from. It was exactly where the second group of Ukrainians should be. The drone spotted the arrival of the BMPs. The first one stopped near the trench. The men took cover behind it and then ran. The second one missed in a way that made the Russians smile behind the steel sights of the RPKs. The armored vehicle stopped more than 200 meters away. No sooner had the track stopped moving, knocking down a small tree in front, the Russians' shots began, raising dust and knocking down the first soldier. The others jumped out in disarray. The BMP retaliated with a 30mm 2A72 cannon, breaking the trench defenses. The men took shelter behind the armored vehicle, knowing that advancing at that distance would be declaring their own death. Igor Avramishin ordered everyone to take shelter and prepare to evacuate the wounded. Up ahead, the first BMP began to retreat, which was the signal for the second armored vehicle to start its return to base. The men saw the machine move and began to reposition themselves while carrying their wounded. The pilots saw the state of the squadron and stopped once more, opening fire on the Russians in an attempt to grant more time for the soldiers. But there was a lack of communication. Lost in the fog of war, emerging more and more into chaos, Avramishin's men didn't notice the new position of the BMP further back. There was no way to communicate with the BMP pilots. Just another fatal mistake in the midst of this onslaught. Avramishin was about to make the last attempt. to rescue one of the wounded when the Russian RPK started a new wave of fire, knocking down 2 more soldiers, including the sergeant. A single survivor tried to run, firing at the trench, but ended up being shot. The men looked at each other, wondering what to do, but the first artillery bomb fell in front of them. Their hope was gone along with another Ukrainian life. It was more of the dark smoke that spread and dispersed along with the lives. The BNP crew realized they could no longer stay there. Without communication with the soldiers, they began to retreat, abandoning the last survivors. For those, all that was left was to bury their faces in the ground while the rocks and dust were kicked up by the Russian ammunition. The last of the soldiers saw when his colleague was mortally wounded by a shot with almost no angle. He had no more chances. It was either to try for the last escape or wait for the earth to absorb his blood right there where he lay. He got up and ran, unaware that on the other side, his colleagues were starting a series of shots that distracted the Russians. The soldier ran, expecting that at any moment something could hit him. The projectile didn't come, not even a bomb. Only fear and memories of horror hit him to create an eternal scar on his spirit. Sutskov saw that the horror only increased. He heard Angelush asking for evacuation support. Up there, the drones were watching them, their evil eyes feeding on every step of the prey. The hum of the mortars came almost like a death song from those birds waiting for the Ukrainians to be hit. Sutskov positioned himself, watching as the flames grew within the Russian shelters. At that moment, the enemies came out desperate, even though they knew their own army was bombing the trench. It was protocol for them to take shelter while the artillery acted, but the fire did not allow it. Confused by the smoke and injuries, the chaos of war filled them with foggy thoughts. Fear killed reason and put them walking into Shutball's sights. With no time to think, all he saw were the shadows moving. Amidst the bombs, the united of the mortars, the spreading smoke, the singing of the cell was practically muffled. The first one didn't fall directly. Sutkov watched in awe as he disappeared from the trench with the gun in his hand. Before the Ukrainian could recover from the surprise, another one emerged in sequence, coming out of the smoke, relieved to finally be able to breathe again. He was the direct target of the attacking soldiers' ammunition. There was no time to think. Between mortars, machine gun fire, all that was left was to shoot at anything that moved and try to take the position. The man fell in the middle of the trench. His body did not serve as a warning for the next one. The third, the Russian, emerged in the same way, so desperate to escape against the others, risking himself under artillery fire. Another one who fell, Sutkov sought cover. There were still more enemies, and the drones were pointing, waiting for the avenged dead. The Ukrainian took advantage of the moment and advanced, hearing Angelus's call for support. He shot at the shelter one more time, knocking down the men who were still trying to hide in the middle of the smoke. One was directly hit. The second retreated into the flames and into the darkness. The fight continued in the midst of the mortar fire. 120 millimeters of hatred descended from the skies. Each time the earth trembled, the drones above pointed their lenses and adjusted the next attack. The Ukrainians knew how close the fall of the bomb that would take their lives was. Still, the shots persisted. In that position, one of the Russians tried to flee further, almost 70 meters away. Sutkov shot without being able to confirm if he had hit. He then turned to his colleagues, trying to confirm if there would be an evacuation. He didn't see Angelus among those who were approaching. The sergeant had disappeared. One of the men just shook his head when asked. The leader was seriously injured and asked to be finished off by one of his subordinates. A cloud of war chaos hid that death from Sutko's eyes. The lives of his friends were fading at the same speed as his ammunition. They had finally taken the Russians' position, but the mortars were becoming more accurate, the ammunition increasingly scarce. With no sign of support, all they could do was run for their lives. They left the Russian trenches all the way to safety. The whistling of the mortars made hearts tremble and the imagination draw disheartening pictures about their fate. It was to duck down, watch stones and earth fly through the air, then get up without letting their legs lose strength. Further ahead, they saw bodies lying on the ground. They thought they were the Russians that the other group had taken down, still not understanding what had happened to Sergeant Avramshan. In fact, those were bodies of their fellow countrymen, fallen since the previous day when the first orders were given to take the Russian positions. It was impossible to rescue those corpses. With no time to mourn the fallen, and with the intention not to join them, they only stopped to hydrate, to conserve energy for the next run. Sutkov found a rocket-propelled grenade among the bodies and aimed at the Russians who were in pursuit. The noise of the AKs and RPKs ceased for a second when the missile exploded further ahead. It was enough time to turn back and make a run for it. The horror had not yet ceased on that exhausting day. There were only 5 running in the open field when they came across more bodies. Among them was a man still alive. They descended upon him to realize that the Ukrainian was breathing lightly, but the Reaper was caressing him with skeletal fingers, calling him to the beyond. He had been suffering since the previous day, life refusing to escape from a place where it would never be removed, except by death. The Ukrainians looked at the bodies of their compatriots, fallen soldiers whose families would probably never have the opportunity to mourn or give a dignified burial. The man still alive made his last request and was finished off by his own colleagues. Thus, another death occurred that day. The escape continued for another 3.5 kilometers when they finally heard the noise of the armored vehicle approaching amidst artillery explosions. The BMP bravely passed between the artillery and Russian mortars, enduring attacks that could have destroyed the vehicle. But it finally reached the exhausted soldiers, their spirits nearly shattered. The combat comes to an end. They had escaped from hell once again, with wounds that pierced soul, body, and mind. Sutskov would return to the war later that same year, about a month later. However, his vehicle ran over a mine. The explosion sent him straight to the hospital, where he began to recover. Ironically, the soldier, who had survived so much, was ultimately brought down by complications from a coronavirus infection acquired in the hospital.